Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings here at the Naval Institute. Today's show is brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield.
What makes good vision coverage? I knew it when I saw it. Things like fully covered vision care exams for all members, access to over 125,000 independent providers and national retailers. That's why I chose Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Vision. See what we can do for you at bcbsfepvision.com.
Okay, a couple great things happening here in Annapolis this week. So on Monday, 2 days ago, we celebrated the 150th birthday of the U.S. Naval Institute. So really exciting event. We had fireworks, believe it or not. We had about 300 people here, all three floors of the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center in full use. It was a great event. And if you missed it, I apologize for you missing it because you missed the party of the year, but it was a great event. Very befitting of our 150 years of service to the sea services. Great event. Okay, today today is Wednesday, the 11th of October, and this is the second of our 3 per semester Warrior Wednesday Warfighter event at the U.S. Naval Academy. So we had about 250, 300 midshipmen, primarily from the class of 2025. So second class midshipmen who are starting to think about what they want to do after graduation. And today's topic was explosive ordnance disposal. And so my guest today is Lieutenant Commander Mikey Golankiewicz. She is class of 2013 at the U.S. Naval Academy. She's an explosive ordnance disposal officer and currently the XO of EOD Expeditionary Support Group 2 based in Virginia Beach. Mikey, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So thanks for sticking around after talking to all the mids. That was fun. They asked some great questions and there was a real enthusiasm and interest in the room. A lot of our, in fact, I will tell you, you're the second EOD officer we've had on the show. The first was your boss, actually. Admiral Andros came on the show earlier this year. One of the things that he talked about was the fact that his command, Navy Expeditionary Combat Command, of which the EOD community is part of that command, was involved heavily, in fact, led the recovery operation for the Chinese spy balloon late last year. So that was pretty exciting. You mentioned to the midshipmen that you played a role in that, so we'll get to that in a couple minutes. But let's talk a little bit about EOD, what the explosive ordnance disposal community does in the Navy. And then, how did you get into it and what kinds of things have you done in your career? So just start with a little bit about EOD at the maybe 30,000 foot perspective.
Yeah, so the EOD or explosive ordnance disposal community specific to the Navy supports is the DoD's only maritime EOD component. So in addition to the conventional surface ordnance, unexploded ordnance threat, or chem-bio, radiological nuclear threat, countering WMDs, countering improvised explosive devices. We also have a large mission area in expeditionary mine countermeasures specific to underwater threats and underwater hazards and clearing those hazards to enable the fleet and other forces to be able to move freely. So as I spoke about a little bit in the brief, EOD is across all 4 services will go to the same schooling down at Eglin Air Force Base at Naval School of Explosive Ordnance Disposal. But the key for Navy EOD specific is that after that basic EOD course is complete, the Navy students will stay and do underwater ordnance division to apply what they learned in dive school or Naval Dive and Salvage Training Center to apply those techniques to underwater UXO or underwater hazard clearance and things like that.
Got it. So you mentioned that after graduating from the academy, you first went to dive school. So how long is that school?
Yes. So for officers, they'll do the Joint Diving Officer program. It's about 6 months, and you'll get a kind of well-rounded base in scuba, surface supplied, recompression chamber operations, Mark 16 underwater breathing apparatus, and then meet up with the enlisted EOD diver class before you go over to EOD school. So you'll take that course with other diving officers from other services as well. So that was about 6 months.
And is that Panama City, Florida?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. It's in Panama City Beach at Naval Dive and Salvage Training Center. And then you just move just down the road for EOD school to Eglin Air Force Base in Destin, Florida for Naval School Explosive Ordnance Disposal, as I mentioned.
Got it. Got it. And then after you were done with all your training, what was your first command? Where'd you go first?
Yeah, so you have a couple for Navy EOD. We've got a couple advanced schools for static line, jump school at Fort Benning, expeditionary combat skills in Gulfport, Mississippi, and then EOD tactical training at Training Unit 1 in San Diego. And I stayed in San Diego and went to EOD Mobile Unit 1 there. My first, when I first checked on board, I deployed as the Feature Operations Officer for our task group supporting Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa based out of Djibouti. And then coming back was a platoon commander for an EOD mobility platoon at the time, sort of like the conventional jack of all trades EOD platoon. And we supported Navy Central Command or Fifth Fleet for EOD response in that area. While we were there, supported Special Operations Command, Central Command up in Syria for Army Special Forces up there, and kind of split that time. So really interesting to see both the Navy Fifth Fleet EOD response hat and also support to SOCCENT and the counter ISIS, counter ID piece up in Syria at that time.
Yeah, you told the midshipmen that you've been in a couple of rough neighborhoods. So you spent some time in country in Syria, and you've also spent some time in country in Somalia.
Yes. So following my tour at Mobile Unit 1, I moved to Virginia Beach out of Little Creek, where I was at EOD Mobile Unit 12, was the platoon commander for NAVSOF, or Naval Special Operations Forces EOD platoon. So we trained and deployed in support of an East Coast SEAL unit. And I was deployed in support of Joint Special Operations Task Force Somalia.
Yeah, lots going on, hunting Al-Shabaab and other groups there in Somalia, right? What kinds of operations did you guys do in Syria?
Yeah, so Syria was really interesting in terms of training SDF and partner forces at that time to go in and try to clear a lot of the IEDs that had been left when Raqqa had been liberated, or other parts. We had forces from our platoon distributed throughout the country. So other forces supporting different Army SF units were doing different specific missions, but ours specifically was focused a lot on recovering, training partner forces and how to render safe, enhancing their tactics, techniques, and procedures in those capabilities, and then building our capability to do exploitation of the items that were recovered, and ultimately dispose of them and expose of both the explosive remnants of war, conventional ordnance, and improvised explosive devices that were there.
Got it. I'm going to ask you a tough question, maybe. Scariest day on the job. What's the most hair-raising thing that you've had to do as an EOD officer?
I was really fortunate in the time that I was there to have a strong unit that was supported. We were coming at a time when we could be deliberate in the actions that we took and the decisions that we made about when to go places at what time. Ultimately, there's always those kind of interesting events working with partner forces and working with folks on increasing TTPs where their idea of cleared or complete on something is not necessarily the same as ours. So working through making sure that everything is actually safe before it's going to be around U.S. forces, and making sure that our forces were safe moving throughout. I think that's just a lot of the challenging piece for the Syria one specifically. In other ones, it's just making sure when our forces supported the Somalian partner forces and training in that area, it was working to make sure that we could enable support to their missions, countering Al-Shabaab and training, and then again, enabling the freedom of movement and support and safety of U.S. forces that were going with them. So making sure we were bringing all the guys back and getting the guys from point A to point B.
Gotcha. So one of the questions that came up during the brief to the midshipmen was, because the EOD is the smallest, you mentioned it's the smallest of the the Navy line communities with only about, I think you said 400 or so officers. So that's, I was in intelligence, which is also one of the smallest communities, but at least twice that size. So, and you talked a little bit about one of the, some things that drew you to this career path. Just, recap that a little bit, because I thought your answer to that question was terrific.
Yeah. So we're the smallest unrestricted line community, as I mentioned, and about 450, 470 officers. And so a piece for me that really drew me to the community when I was here, I arrived at the Naval Academy and didn't know anything about Navy EOD and learned about it more and more as I was here. But what initially drew me to it was the ability to execute and lead in a small unit leadership position very shortly after graduation and completing the training pipeline in a very hands-on, complex tactical mission, working in a small team that had to solve a really challenging problem. At the time when I was going to school and graduating, so much of that was focused on the counterterrorism or counter VEO, counter ID centric GWAT fight. But it's really that similar mindset now as we shift into a peer-to-peer, near-peer threat and different adversary. It's still the idea of taking a small unit, giving them a complex task, and the ability to execute and solve that mission area and just work in a small unit leadership capacity. I knew it was going to be a challenge for me, which it has been at every tour, but it's also been incredibly rewarding.
Got it. So there's a couple of different communities or sub-communities within EOD. You talked about some of those with the midshipmen. Describe them, for the audience here. You've got the expeditionary mine countermeasures. There's diving and salvage. There's explosive ordnance. Just talk about some of those and where you've fit your career in those micro communities, if you will.
Right. So we're all a part of the EOD community. And the interesting thing that I think is that there are different areas, or different mission areas, I should say, within that can all encompass an EOD officer or EOD technician's career. So you have mine countermeasures, meaning you could be on an expeditionary mine countermeasures company, which takes a mine countermeasures EOD platoon, pairs them with an unmanned systems platoon of other rates that maintain and operate the unmanned underwater vehicles. You could be on, as I was on a EOD platoon and do more of like conventional under unexploded ordnance, protection of personnel and property, base response in certain areas, training with partner forces, different things like that. There's the Chem Bio, Rad Nuke, assessment and response teams, CART teams that'll support. And then, as I mentioned, NavSof and support to Army and Navy Special Forces. So there's a bunch of different kind of avenues that you can go into and all have experience. Again, I think one of the benefits of our community is it really looks at, when you graduate from EOD school, you have a basic knowledge of core competencies and skills. And you should expect that when you get to your first mobile unit, you'll again start a training pipeline for that specific, for not just the rest board or platoon that you're on, but to encompass the whole breadth of EOD mission areas underneath that. And then when you get into more phases, focusing on specifically where you're going to be deployed and your specific mission area there. But you can have that opportunity multiple times over a career to change and do a different mission area from one to the next. So in my case, it was looking at, hey, going from a support to a platoon supporting NSW to then going to being the operations officer at Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 2. I was never on a mobile diving and salvage company as the company commander. It's a unit that we have at the Mobile Diving and Salvage Units, primarily responsible for salvage, port damage repair, expeditionary battle damage repair, and that capability. So really interesting challenge for me as the operations officer to learn from the tactical leaders, the divers, the LCP, the leading chief petty officers, company commanders, master divers on those units, of how do I apply their technical expertise and communicate up to what leadership needs to know to accomplish a specific mission. And that is, I think, emblematic of our community in terms of continuing to escalate the problem sets that you can get and the challenges that you can get, and relying on that basis of core fundamentals and ability to solve problems to get to the other side of it.
Gotcha. So one of the things I picked up on one of your slides when you were briefing the midshipmen was that your community, the EOD community, is not gender restricted. So you're, woman lieutenant commander,
Mhm.
halfway through a 20-year career, hopefully more than that. How many women are in the community, and how many women are, coming in as new ensigns a year? And did that present any, specific challenges for you in the community?
Yeah, so I don't have that's a really great question. I don't have the exact numbers on
Not
the
exact.
number of
No,
women in the
yeah,
community. It is a very
ballpark.
small subset. But in terms of one thing that I do benefit from and think is really incredible about our community is that while, there's 30, maybe some women in the community, it is an incredibly tight knit group of women. And I've been fortunate to have both male and female mentors in the community, but specifically the female mentors that I've had in the community have really done a lot to foster a sense of community across all of the women in the community, and work to kind of create networks where we can reach out. I would say that a lot of my challenges as an EOD officer are, while they definitely have applied and there have been challenges being a woman, and as there would be in any male dominated field or in the Navy or Marine Corps in general, they've also been challenges that I think a lot of my male counterparts have had in terms of like, how do you do small unit leadership? How do you lead a team where you were just going through school with the people that now you're on the same team with, or you show up and you're the platoon or company commander or an ops or an XO, and you don't have the same amount of tactical time expertise as, an LCPO or an LPO or other person in that field, and you still have to execute the mission and work to bring all of that expertise together. So I think a lot of my challenges have been seen by my male counterparts as well, but when there are ones that are specific, it's great to have that network of women to reach out to in the community. And I've learned so much from the women that are senior to me, but also the women that are junior, that we have just such an incredible caliber of candidates coming into the community in general, both male and female. And I really have learned a lot from them. And it's been awesome to see that kind of continue. And it's helped me, and I hope it's been helpful for them as well. So we're
Yeah.
small,
So
but I think a tight knit group.
yeah, and you do some very cool stuff. So I from your slides, you got dive schools. You're learning how to do underwater operations. You're learning how to do some land-based operations with your joint counterparts. You're learning how to, take apart and render safe, explosive ordnance. You're dealing with IEDs. You're going to jump school. So it's different than naval special warfare, but you do a lot of this, very similar skills, and you work very closely with them. It just seemed incredibly exciting to see some of the things that were on your slides. I was like, man, they do some cool stuff.
Yeah, I think our community is really unique, and I would say it's very different. It's a different mission area. It's a different community. I was really drawn to the EOD community, and my time here at the academy was fortunate enough, when I checked on board Mobile Unit 1 that with the timing that the combat exclusion rule was lifted shortly after, which enabled me the opportunity to go and serve on some of those teams. And really it was that ability to do that after that rule was lifted, but also just the advocacy that I had from other mentors and leaders in the community that gave me the skills and taught me what I needed to know and gave me the opportunity to continue to learn. So both succeeding and failing, as any other JO in our community or in any other community will do, and learn throughout the process, has been really rewarding.
That's awesome. I mentioned it at the start of the show that Admiral Andros was here a few months ago talking about being the officer in charge of the recovery operation for the Chinese spy balloon wreckage. And you mentioned to the mids that you were part of that operation. So we got the 1-star level, here's what we did. So tell us the lieutenant commander level, what you did, what kinds of things did you do, but then also what your sailors did.
Yeah. So really interesting opportunity. And I'm sure, I don't have the same didn't have the same lens on it as Admiral Andros from my seat in the operations office. So I was the operations officer at Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 2. When we initially heard word of the tasking, our command was certified to support DISCA operations or Maritime Homeland Defense operations, and so was tapped to be the lead C2 for that operation when it was going through. One, because of just we were in that capacity, but also because the mission was coming through, and specifically what NECC, the phase that NECC was tasked with, was the recovery and the salvage. So recovery primarily fell into the search, and recovery primarily fell into looking at employing expeditionary mine countermeasures, area search platoon, dive teams, other assets, EOD heavy assets like that, EOD and UMS, as I mentioned, unmanned systems. And then the recovery and salvage is where the Mobile Diving and Salvage Company from MUDSU 2 worked with the assets they were on to both salvage and lift the components once we had gotten them and transfer them at sea to the surface assets that we had there. So that was kind of how our command came into the fold on the C2 piece for it down on the ground. We had forces distributed on an MSC vessel for the Mobile Diving and Salvage Company, Military Sea Lift Command. And then we also had forces that moved via land to launch from shore down in South Carolina for the search and recovery as well. So that was initially one expeditionary mine countermeasures company. We later grew that to 2 with some additional EOD shore-based detachment assets and dive teams, and an area search platoon also from Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 2. So really interesting opportunity for me at the tactical level to see the integration of multiple missions within the EOD community in terms of an MDS company and an expeditionary mine countermeasures company integrating and using kind of different skill sets. We already have that integration on an XMCM company through, as I mentioned, the unmanned systems platoon, employing UUVs, using that data analysis to drive what assets and how the mine countermeasures EOD platoon employs assets. And then from there, once they had identified it and the Mobile Diving and Salvage Company got on station, using their expertise to salvage that and lift that and turn it over, ultimately turning it over to the FBI as they were the lead agency. So really interesting for me at the operations level to see how we just battle space management in terms of having surface, subsurface. We also brought in air assets to do air mine countermeasures and support with helos as well. So looking at, and then we had surface vessels in the area, Coast Guard assets were maintaining security. So just a huge amount of resources, and just from the solely tactical perspective of making sure everyone can operate in a safe environment at the same time was a challenge that I hadn't seen before or hadn't gotten to work, and was really challenging, but also rewarding to see that come into play. And specifically with our community, I think one of the most valuable parts that I took about it, and I talked about it with the MIDs, is that when that call came out, the answer that I really felt like the community had was not who has to go or who is officially on the hook to respond to this. Everybody across our force really looked at how do we get the best assets down there as quickly as possible to solve this problem. And it's a problem that's a little bit outside, right, of what the mission area of those platoons and units, I would say, is. But in line with the larger, I think, idea of the community is use the baseline knowledge that you have, use the skills that you have, use the tools that you have, and solve a complex problem. And really awesome to see the community come together and really try to find the best solution and the best people to that problem. The unit that I'm at right now is the XO, Expeditionary Support Unit 2, played a huge role in the communications and the logistics and movement and mobility, maintaining all those assets and making sure we could keep everything going on what essentially became a 24-hour cycle when you try to look at using the unmanned underwater vehicles, understanding the time it will take you to do post-mission analysis on the data they can retrieve from the bottom, factoring that into how long it will take to get dive assets on station for both remotely operated vehicles or divers in the water. And then also the turnover time for those assets to surface, to fleet assets that were in the area, nesting all of that with, you have air assets overhead, Coast Guard assets maintaining security in a civilian, boat traffic area. Really, really interesting challenge to have at the pretty, I think, relatively junior level, and was really rewarding.
Was that a week, 10 days, 14 days? How long a deployment was that for you to South Carolina from Virginia Beach?
I think it ended up being about 10 days. So initially I was planning to be embarked on the Rosebud with the Mobile Diving and Salvage Company. We had planned to layer and split our C2 across ground forces that were launching search assets, and then what we thought would be a longer salvage problem on the Rosebud. Different assets or different factors shifted that to where I also went down to South Carolina with the rest of our C2 team and a large amount of the search and diving assets that were down there. So we had a large contingent of forces that the HM-15, when they joined as well, came down to South Carolina as well. So the large amount of our forces were concentrated in South Carolina. We had a Mobile Diving and Salvage Company embarked for the salvage as well. And then that was specific to us, and then also additional surface forces, as I mentioned, in the area, other ships in the area, and Coast Guard assets.
I remember Admiral Andros mentioned that the desire was to shoot it down, obviously not over a populated area, which made it ideal to shoot it down over the sea. But where is it going to go feet wet was one of the problems. And then trying to make sure that it was shot down over the sea, but inside the 13 nautical mile territorial seas of the United States. So we had the right to, full rights to recover it. And then, he said this is something we'd never seen before. We'd never had our hands on it. What's it going to do when it falls out of the sky, when it hits the surface? And then if it sinks, I remember specifically, he said, is it going to feather down? Is it going to drift off in one direction or another? Is it going to sink like a rock? None of those things were known. And so, to your point, the unmanned undersea vehicles that you have, that your teams have, putting those in the water to find it, right? And also to identify what might be the Chinese spy balloon wreckage from other detritus on the bottom of the sea, instead of putting divers actually down there who have a limited amount of time that they can spend on the bottom and stuff like that. You don't want them trying to go find it when you've got unmanned assets that could find it, and then you can put the divers in the water. So really, interesting. Back to your point about the need for people in your community to be able to solve complex problems on the fly, right? And including things you've never seen before.
I know. I think that's a huge example of right now how we'll continue to grow, and how the place for our community in the Navy, I think it continues to be there, because there will always be, we have a very specific mission area that we go to basic EOD school to train to. And it really just builds like your skill sets. I look at it as building your skill sets and your ability to learn, and the idea that you have to continue to learn throughout your time in the community. And so I think it's a great example of apply what you learn in one mission area, say maybe like a heavy mine countermeasures or a salvage background for the Mobile Diving and Salvage Company, and apply it to this somewhat similar but also very different scenario of, we have an unknown asset that has fallen from tens of thousands of feet, and we don't know the condition that it's going to be in. But when you get there, we need to have everything that you would want to raise it off of the bottom. Really different from traditional salvage of a vessel or downed aircraft or something, where we can look at like the schematics of that, have time to do surveys and everything like that. So I mean, really valuable experience for our team, but also I think highlighted at the tactical level, at the most junior units of action, the company command, the company command leadership, for both the MDS company, the Expeditionary Mine Countermeasures Company, the platoons, and the shore-based detachments that were down there. A lot of ingenuity on their part of, how do we do this? How do we do this efficiently? And what's the best way to accomplish this mission was really awesome to see, frankly. from their
Yeah, that's
efforts.
fantastic. Well, we are close to out of time. I would be remiss if I didn't do this because I mentioned to Admiral Andrews, it's been a while since we've had EOD officers or enlisted techs writing in proceedings. And every year, the April issue of proceedings is our expeditionary warfare issue. So it's kind of tailor-made for your organization. But really, almost any issue could be something that we fold in an EOD topic or a mine countermeasures topic or any of the skill sets that you mentioned today. So I threw out this invitation to you and to all in your community. We'd love to have you write for proceedings. We'd love to hear more about this very special, very niche community with some incredible capabilities that enable other parts of the Navy to do what they do. So it's important. We'd love to have that voice in the pages of proceedings, any issue, but especially in the April issue. So when you go back to Virginia Beach, and then also your the JOs who are working for you, that hey, I've got a writing assignment for you, right? We'd love to see it.
Yeah, we will. I'm sure we've got a bunch of folks working that as well.
Awesome. Well, any saved rounds for us?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's always great to talk to midshipmen and kind of recap on the community, and just appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's great to have you. Thanks for coming up and doing this today, both talking to the midshipmen for the Warfighter event and then being on the show. This has been really terrific, and I hope to hear from you again soon.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings Podcast, brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield.
What makes good vision coverage? I knew it when I saw it. Things like fully covered vision care exams for all members. Access to over 125,000 independent providers and national retailers. That's why I chose Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Vision. See what we can do for you at bcbsfepvision.com.
And until next week, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.